Okay. So good morning and welcome to our second session of the discussion of Yuval Noah Harari's Nexus. And our first session was also canceled because of snow. So I thought it would be hard to start the initial session not in person, and I always prefer that we do these things in person. But at least now that we're started, and we only have three other sessions after today, so we'll do our best to get through discussion. There's so much to talk about. We will be meeting again next week, hopefully in person, and then we'll have the live stream for those who can't make it on February 1st. And then we have March 29th and April 26th. So my plan is that for today, we got through the prologue, chapter 1, and half of chapter 2 when we met last time. So my plan for today is to finish talking about chapter 2 and go through chapter 3. And then there's a lot that immediately follows that on chapter 4, that I want to do next week, and hopefully we'll also cover most of chapter 5. Then the two other sessions that are more spread out are in March and April, March 29th, April 26th. Those will focus on the on his discussion of totalitarianism and democracy and the contemporary implications. So basically, today and a week from today, we'll go through his sort of historical schema of how human networks work, what his theory is, and then the next last two sessions will have the application. So I think that'll work well with a discussion of the of the work. So again, I ask that please put yourself on mute if you're not speaking, so that it's
It's
easier.
with
I'm going to
Gmail.
mute some of you because I hear some background noise there. And but if you want to, it's pretend that we are in person, and you can unmute and ask a question, or if you know how to raise the hand button, there's in the reaction button on the bottom, there's a thing for raise hand. And then if you do that, then I'll see your hand raised, and then I will, be able to, now that we can do our best to have a discussion then. Um, when we're in person, we have to use our manners to speak only at one time. When we're on Zoom, we don't have a choice, right? Because otherwise it doesn't work with multiple sound. All right. We were talking about his discussion about the Passover Seder as the telling of a story, which was on page 24. That's where I stopped last time. So I'm going to jump in. We're going to go right into that. And he has this idea of what he calls an intersubjective reality, right? And the point that he's saying there is that there's three levels of communications, which is the basis of a communication network on the oral level of storytelling. And what we had said last time we met, remember, is that the evolutionary advance of sapiens over other apes is that as sapiens, as humans, were able to tell stories, and that exponentially expands the network of people that we can reach and what allows us to form larger cooperative communities. So his point here in this section called intersubjective entities is that there's the first level, which is objective, which is just scientific, just reality. And then there's the second level, which is the subjective reality. And the subjective reality is how we interpret something, although um, he might not use those terms specifically. And then the third level is what's called the intersubjective reality, which is the interplace of our interpretation with other people's interpretations, which is the level of the telling of stories, right? And that's what he's getting at here. And then I want to go to page 26 when he says, the middle of the page there, in contrast to animals whose existence can be verified or disproved through objective tests. And he had this example talking about the Loch Ness monster, right? That he says there are some people that insist that there is a dinosaur living in the bottom of the of Loch Ness, of the lake in Scotland. But he says you can do experiments and you can determine whether an animal exists or doesn't exist. In contrast to animals whose existence can be verified or disproved through objective tests, states are intersubjective entities. And he makes this leap from belief in the Loch Ness monster to belief in a state, right? Both are, in a sense, fictions, right? They're not, neither are scientific entities, are not biological entities. The animal, you can prove it's not there, but it's the idea of a sovereign state is a, in one's own opinion, is subjective, and then on the level of politics is an intersubjective because people have to agree together. And he says, and sometimes there's disagreement. There are cases when people
Hi,
disagree.
Rabbi.
Oh, I'm just
Really
muting
good
you.
teacher.
Okay, please remind to mute yourself unless you're trying to ask me a question. Um, in con There are cases where people disagree about the existence of certain states, and that then their intersubjective status emerges. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for example, revolves around this matter because some people and governments refuse to acknowledge the existence of Israel and others refuse to acknowledge the existence of Palestine. So this is one of a number of areas in this book where he directly addresses his Jewish identity and his Israeli identity, which is something that Harari didn't do in his previous books. So I thought that was very important here, how that's his first example, how you have a difference of opinion between different stories that people tell. And he breaks it down right there, right? As of 2024, when he did the writing of the book, the governments of Brazil and China say that both Israel and Palestine exist. The governments of the United States and Cameroon recognize only Israel's existence, whereas the governments of Algeria and Iran recognize only Palestine. Right. So you have either or not, right? Different scenarios there for the recognition of a state of Palestine, a state of Israel, and that's an example of you have a difference of opinion of intersubjective reality because you're not going to have agreement because you have disagreements of about stories. And then when he continues that discussion on page 27, right, he talks about that of all genres of stories, those that create intersubjective realities have been the most crucial for the development of large-scale human networks. Implanting fake family memories is certainly helpful, but no religions or empires manage to survive for long without a strong belief in the existence of a god, a nation, a law code, or a currency. And he takes those four, and in the next paragraph, he just says laws, gods, and currency, right, are the things that in specifically for states or human communities are the most important. He doesn't want to use the term fiction, but that's what he's getting at there, because none of them are objective, right? They're just dependent on agreements between people. Certainly currency is, right? A dollar bill is just a piece of paper. So the only reason why it has value is that we in the community agree that it has value, right? So that's what a currency is. It's because of a story that is told on the piece of paper of the dollar bill, right? It has a picture of George Washington, and it says United States of America. It has the signature of the Secretary of the Treasury. It says "In God We Trust." All of that is telling a story that we have faith in the authority of the sovereignty of the United States to print currency that the state backs and that we can agree to use of value. And that's why, there are certain, hard currencies generally more acceptable than, non-hard currencies where there's less faith in the stability of the state to back the currency, for example. So in that middle paragraph, he says, formation of the Christian church, for example, it was important that people recollect what Jesus said at the Last Supper. But the crucial step was making people believe that Jesus was a God rather than just an inspiring rabbi. For the formation of the Jewish religion, it was helpful that Jews remembered how they together escaped slavery in Egypt, but the really decisive step was making all Jews adhere to the same religious law code, the halakha. So there he's talking about religious practice, talking about the church establishes the rituals of the communion, which is the sacrament that's based on what Jesus would have said at the Last Supper, whereas the halakha, which is Jewish law, is based on the laws that God gave Moses and the people at Mount Sinai, which is told through the story of the Exodus from Egypt. That's why in the Ten Commandments movie that we've all seen, it ends with the giving of the Ten Commandments. So Cecil B. DeMille understood that the force of the laws was rooted in a story, and he was telling the narrative of that story that then concluded with the Ten Commandments. Ten Commandments plays an important role. Actually, we're going to get to it next week. Not the movie, the laws, right? We get to that next week in our discussion here. So, in both cases, he's saying that it's a story that explains, right? And that's not any way original. That it's in the very first comment of Rashi on the Torah. By the way, when the Torah starts with the story of the creation, there's a Rashi's first comment. He says, "Why doesn't this Torah just start with Exodus 12, which is the laws of the Passover Seder? Why does it tell all these stories if the purpose is just to tell us what God wants of us?" And the answer that Rashi gives is that you need a narrative, you need a story in order to explain why you have the laws. I mean, he doesn't say it that way, but that's essentially what he's saying in that very first comment. And that's what Harari is trying to explain here, even though I think he fundamentally misunderstands religion, which we'll get to a little bit today and more next week. This passage here was critical. And then that last paragraph on 27, intersubjective things like laws, gods, and currencies are extremely powerful within a particular information network and utterly meaningless outside it. Right? So a law is a convention, right? Laws only have force when people agree to follow them. And in a sense, a currency is similar to a law. Currency regulates trade, laws regulate social interactions between people. And gods, he's throwing into that sequence of intersubjective ideas, right? Because he's saying that the belief in a god is an agreement of the people that form a theological system and that forms a community from that. And that's why all different societies and cultures have their own ideas of what God is, in a sense. Um, so moving along, the power of stories from 28. And here's his basic thing. Again, he's summarizing very briefly what he lays out in more detail in Sapiens, his first book. Stone Age sapiens, too, lived in small bands of a few dozen individuals, comparing sapiens with Neanderthals. But following the emergence of storytelling, sapien bands no longer lived in isolation. Bands were connected by stories about things like revered ancestors, totem animals, guardian spirits. Bands that shared stories and intersubjective realities constituted a tribe. Each tribe was a network connecting hundreds or even thousands of individuals. So that's what I had said briefly in my introduction, right? That it's that ability to tell stories that exponentially expands human communities. What we were saying last week, explaining that it's the biologically we're capable of knowing a maximum of 200 people, right? That's pretty much the maximum of people that we're able to know personally, that we're able to remember who their family members are, what their backgrounds are. And some of us can exceed that number, like Joe, for example, right? And others who just remember everybody and everyone's connections to everybody else. But for the most part, it says it's about 200 is pretty much the max. For many of us, it's more like 100. But by telling stories, we're able to connect personally in a way that we can on an individual level. And that's the first level of the technology of a network technology that creates a nexus that builds larger communities that he's talking about. And from there, he goes on to an interesting critique of Marxism. So Marxism had tremendous influence on the way that history was understood, by generations of historians. And Karl Marx's theory is that history is driven by the materialist struggle between classes, right? And Harari questions all of that, and he says no. The moving power behind history is ideas. Ideas are what people really get excited about, and that's what drives them. The stories, and that's what drives people to do things. And he says that the bottom of if you look at the bottom of 29, the end of the middle paragraph, the Crusades, World War I, the Iraq War, We're all fought for the economic interests of powerful elites rather than for religious, nationalist, or liberal ideas. Understanding these wars means setting aside all the mythological fig leaves about God, patriotism, and democracy and observing power relations in their nakedness. So that would be the Marxist approach. And then Harari says this Marxist view, however, is not only cynical but wrong. Right, very, very strong words there. He says Marx completely understand, and all of the Marxist historians completely misunderstand that the Crusades is not just about power relations, right, or World War One or the Iraq War. I remember when the first Iraq War, the first Gulf War over Kuwait came out, and there were um, some people, there was the argument that it was all about oil, and yeah, oil and the concern about control over resources was a part of the calculation of the Gulf War, but it can't be solely that, right? It was also about the ideas. It was about the ideas of an international order, about maintaining an international order in the wake of the end of the Cold War. And it was about ideas about sovereignty, ideas that we're still very passionate about today, in our own contemporary sense. So what Harari writes is, while materialist interests certainly played a role in the Crusades, World War One, the Iraq War, and most other human conflicts, it does not mean that religious, national, and liberal ideas played no role at all. Materialist interests by themselves cannot explain the identity of the rival camps. And then he goes on, on the next top of page 30, he says, why is it that in 2003, the United States and Britain sought to conquer the oil fields of Iraq rather than the gas fields of Norway? Can this really be explained by purely materialist considerations without any recourse to people's religious and ideological beliefs, right? If it was just about oil, then they could have attacked Norway instead of Iraq. And that strikes me today, right, when we've gone through a week's news cycle about American threats against Denmark, right, over Greenland. It reads differently than I think how Harari read that paragraph, right? That today it's not as right. When was this book came out in 2024, and 2026 is not as unreasonable as it was in 2024 that a Western power could attack Norway for oil, and that's how quickly that things change. But underneath it, I think Harari's point is still correct, right? Is that it's not just about control of resources, it's about a narrative. And one of the reasons why I wanted us to, I think it's valuable to read through a book like this today is that while Harari's talking about how to understand the way that human history has always worked, I think it sheds a lot of light over the very fast-moving news cycles and disturbing events of the world around us today, right? And understanding how stories are told and how people get behind those stories, right? So if there's a reason behind the president's interest in Greenland, it's because of a story that the president is trying to narrate. And it's important to understand what are the elements of that story and why it appeals to certain people and angers other people, and how that story forms communities and creates a tribe in a sense. And that's how you get communal cooperation. So back to page 30. In fact, all relations between large-scale human groups are shaped by stories because the identities of these groups are themselves defined by stories. And that's the point there, right? That it is a story. And throughout this book, and this is the part that we'll get to in March and April, when he's talking about the Soviet Union, about under Stalin, and he's talking about Nazi Germany, trying to understand the stories and how the stories that Hitler and Stalin told are able to form communities and then create powerful communities, right? And how those stories are used, and that's important for us to understand how stories are used in our contemporary world as well. So his point there, the end of that paragraph, contrary to Marx's thinking, large-scale identities and interests in history are always intersubjective. They are never objective. And that's his main critique of Marxism, that the refreshing approach and the reason why so many historians were so interested or so influenced by Marxism was that it offered a sort of scientific objective code for understanding how history works. And what Harari is saying is that history is not about science, it's about poetry. You know, it's about it can't be understood through a formula. It's not merely, and not that materialism is unimportant, it plays a role. People are always want to be more comfortable than they are and are unhappy when they're not comfortable. And that's certainly a primary driving force, but it's not, that's just the beginning level, right? It's what separates sapiens from other apes, and that's the I think the real original contribution of Harari for understanding world history is to understand it from a species perspective, right? Is why, because other species are interested in their own, want food and want comfort, and will attack other animals for that. What makes us different is how we get caught up in stories, and that's the very original approach here. Um, okay, so he says, and in the middle of 30, he says, "This is good news." That's great. It's one of the best lines in the book. This is good news. Another line is going to come later in the chapter that I'll point out. The reason why it's a great line is because most of this book is rather depressing, right? Because he starts right out, he's saying it's the most important part. Like he says, as liberal progressives, we always used to say that it's just a problem of education, all the problems in the world. That as long as we teach more and we get more information out, people will be compelled to look at the facts, right? And if they don't, they're just ignoring reality. But the more we educate people, the more they will be immune from fake news, right? And will understand the way that things really are. And what he's hammers through this book is that unfortunately doesn't work that way, right? And that simply having more data does not make one more moral, more ethical, or it doesn't affect the trajectory of how a society works. It's what his critique of the naive theory of information, which he comes back to throughout the book. So most of the book then is very depressing. It's like you have all these advances, and it brings us to terrible totalitarian um, societies. So it's great when he says it's good news. And the good news here is he says that if history had been shaped solely by material interests and power struggles, there would be no point talking to people who would disagree with us. But because history is affected by stories, that means that we can talk about a story that is a good story, right? And that we can think about the stories and we can be critical about the stories that we tell. It's something that is incredibly important, I think, as we enter the 250th, birthday year of the United States, because a lot of the focus over between now and July is going to be talking about what is the story that we tell about America, right? So they're not everyone tells the same story, as we were well aware, right? But the fact that it's intersubjective means that we have an opportunity of selling our story. Um, and the story forms our identity. It was one of my favorite lines from President Obama. I mentioned this before, when he would be criticizing something, he would say, "This is not who we are," as if who we are as Americans is a story, was a narrative that he was preaching, and that's a challenge, right? In order to do that, but it's also an opportunity. So Harari says here at the end of that paragraph, luckily, right, since history is shaped by intersubjective stories, sometimes we can avert conflict and make peace by talking with people, changing the stories in which they and we believe, or coming up with a new story that everyone can accept, right? And that's the challenge. And then he immediately goes into Nazism. And you'd think like Nazi Germany is the worst example to prove that, because it was based on a story, right? Hitler and Goebbels were the masters of the use of propaganda, the use of narrative, of using facts as propaganda tools to tell one particular story. but he makes the point that it was a story, and we can confidently say it's the middle of 31 that it was a mistake, and that Germans could have chosen better stories because we know what happened next. But 12 years of Nazi rule didn't foster the Germans' material interests. Nazism led to the destruction of Germany and the deaths of millions. Later, when Germans adopted liberal democracy, this did lead to a lasting improvement in their lives. Right. So, in the broader scheme, right, in the wake of the defeat of Nazi Germany, Germany turned into a liberal democracy, which although the price was extremely high, right? The Germany is obviously a much better country now than it was or in during the Third Reich and as people imagined in the years leading to the Third Reich. And then he says, couldn't the Germans have skipped the failed Nazi experiment and put their faith in liberal democracy already in the 1930s? The position of this book is that they could have. Right? History is often shaped not by deterministic power relations, but rather by tragic mistakes that result from believing in mesmerizing but harmful stories. So there's a positive and a negative, right? The scary part of what Harari is saying is that if stories is what drive history, then people follow bad stories. And then it brings them to do terrible things and believe in the wrong ideas and hurtful ideas. And we see that just in today's news, right? But it also means that they're not determined to go a different way and that the power relations don't determine doing one thing. And that if history is determined by stories and we have the opportunity of telling different stories, and his connection here is what meant a lot to me because my academic work in modern German history, is sort of I've talked about this in other contexts that I certainly fall in the school, and there's a debate in historiography over this whether the rise of the Nazis was determined, was inevitable, or if it was not inevitable, and that it could have gone either way, and that for me was always the more moral way to tell the story. It's that human beings are all capable of both good things and terrible things, and that the Nazis rose to power in Germany. They could have just as easily not come to power in Germany, and we could just as easily have a similar rise of a totalitarian state in any country, including our own. And that's what Philip Roth's The Plot Against America is prescient about, in looking back at history, but it's also a warning for the future of how, we shouldn't think that we're immune to what happened in Germany, and that's certainly something also that's in the minds of maybe half of Americans today. And then the next section, again, raise a hand if you have a comment. Otherwise, I'm going to keep going. The next section is subtitled "The Noble Lie," which is a quotation from Plato's Republic that he talks about on page 34. And it's the idea that you have to tell a story, and even if the story is based on a fiction, it's still a good story. And this is something that he understands, but he misses certain points. So in the bottom of 32, he's talking there about Oppenheimer and the Manhattan Project, and talks about how the cooperation of so many people were involved in this project. And it's the difference. And it's also a great example about how you have what's objective and what's subjective and intersubjective. Because the science of building a nuclear bomb is an objective process. But he says if you build a bomb and ignore the facts of physics, the bomb will not explode. But if you build an ideology and ignore the facts, the ideology may still prove explosive. That's a great line there also, right? And that's the difference between ideology and objective inventions, right? A scientific technology, a physical technology based on physics can only follow the laws of physics. But an ideology does not have to follow objective facts. It follows a story that people obey. And then he talks here about the difference between the scientists and the politicians, and how the politicians are the one who have the power, not the scientists, because the politicians are the ones who tell the stories, and that's what builds communities. So he says here, while power depends on both truth and order, It is usually the people who know how to build ideologies and maintain order who give instructions to the people who merely know how to build bombs and hunt mammoths. Robert, and they're the whole spread of human history from prehistoric times till the nuclear bomb is related in that one sentence there. Robert Oppenheimer obeyed Franklin Delano Roosevelt rather than the other way around. Similarly, Werner Heisenberg obeyed Adolf Hitler, Igor Kurchatov deferred to Joseph Stalin, and in contemporary Iran, experts in nuclear physics follow the orders of experts in Shiite theology. And the spread there from Roosevelt to Hitler to contemporary Iran is an interesting connection there. The assumption is that FDR's ideology was a good ideology, whereas Hitler and Stalin and the Khomeini are not, but they're fundamentally the same use of information technology because they're based on stories. So, and then he goes back to this idea that it's not, the just information itself is not enough. That it's true that E equals MC square. It explains a lot about what happens in the universe. But knowing that E equals MC square usually doesn't resolve political disagreements, and it usually doesn't inspire people to make sacrifices for a common cause. Instead, what holds human networks together tends to be fictional stories, especially stories about intersubjective things like gods, money, and nations, right? Those were those ideas talking about earlier in the chapter. When it comes to uniting people, fiction enjoys two inherent advantages over the truth. First, fiction can be made as simple as we like, whereas the truth tends to be complicated because the reality it is supposed to represent is complicated. So this is one of the basic ideas and goes through in the next chapter. We talks about bureaucracy, that people like simple stories, not complicated stories. So a scientist is going to talk about a complicated story, but a politician will tell a simple story. And it's the simple story that people latch on to. And that's what the more successful politicians are, the ones who are able to tell a story that people can understand and can latch on to. And that's a key truism there that he understands very well. Um, he says, take, for example, the truth about nations. It is difficult to grasp that the nation to which one belongs is an intersubjective entity that exists only in our collective imagination, right? We can understand our local community, right? We understand what it means to be a part of Temple Israel or a part of Greater Ridgewood. But to understand what the United States means is more complicated. It's certainly complicated today in Minnesota, right? Um, and to give an example from the opposite side, was difficult to understand in the South in the middle of the 19th century, right? So it's difficult, so he writes, to understand the nation to which one belongs. You rarely hear politicians say such things in their political speeches. It is far easier to believe that our nation is God's chosen people entrusted by the Creator with some special mission. This simple story has been repeatedly told by countless politicians from Israel to Iran and from the United States to Russia. So the way that the politicians, who are the storytellers of nations, get people to identify with the nation is that they tell a story that gives the technology for people to take a leap over the extraordinary amount of people that we can't possibly fathom the way we think about our own community in a synagogue, for example. And the way that they tell those stories is to say that we're God's chosen people, that God chose us for a special mission. Now, he's being very critical of that, right? And when he says from Israel to Iran, United States to Russia, you can say critical things about all those four examples and how they're used for the benefit of one people to the detriment of another. And the second, he writes at the bottom of the page, the truth is often painful and disturbing. That if we try to make it more comforting and flattering, it will no longer be the truth. In contrast, fiction is highly malleable. The history of every nation contains some dark episodes that citizens don't like to acknowledge and remember. And then he goes back to Israel here. And again, this is what makes this book very emotional, I think, from what he's sharing. He says, an Israeli politician who in her election speeches details the miseries inflicted on Palestinian civilians by Israeli occupation is unlikely to get many votes. In contrast, a politician who builds a national myth by ignoring uncomfortable facts, focusing on glorious moments in the Jewish past, and embellishing reality wherever necessary may well sweep to power. That's not just the case in Israel, it's the case of all countries. An uncompromising adherence to the truth is essential for scientific progress and is also an admirable spiritual practice, but is not a winning political strategy. So, and that's where the winning political strategy is to get people behind, to not deal with the messy truths, right? Um, I think that some of the analysis of the United States today, right, they're saying that the challenge facing the Democrats, right, is what is the story that they're trying to tell, right? And how do you counter the narrative that the Republicans are are are, are telling? And that's the challenge in certainly in every election cycle. And it's usually the side that has a better story is the one that wins the election. And it's sort of always been that way. And unfortunately, as disturbing, it's not based on an acknowledgement of the truth. And it works on both ends, right? So President Biden, his favorite line was that he said over and over again, which he ended every speech, was, we're the United States of America. There's nothing that we can't do. So that is a narrative that was meant to counter President Trump's narrative, right? Where President Trump is talking about take the exceptionalism of America and the might, the power of America. President Biden was talking about telling a similar story from a different perspective, but to say that it's American ingenuity and American success and the ability of Americans to work with each other and defeat challenges. And that's a story. And that was a story that President Biden told. Okay, so sometimes the story is fictional, and that's why it's called The Noble Lie by Plato, right? That you're telling the lie. It's noble, but you do have to lie in order to bring people together. Um, the irony that he has to admit is that Plato never managed to actually set up any society based on the Republic, and yet its influence throughout history is extraordinary. So we go to the bottom of 34. He says, Plato's lie notwithstanding, telling a fictional story is lying only when you pretend that the story is a true representation of reality. Telling a fictional story isn't lying when you avoid such pretense and acknowledge that you are trying to create a new intersubjective reality rather than represent a pre-existing objective reality. I think he's being too simplistic there and too black and white. That I think that Harari is talking about the importance of storytelling, but he also wants to root it so much in objective reality that he says the only responsible way to tell a story is to tell people that it's a representation of reality, but not the full reality, and that's already making it complicated to the point where you won't win an election. And you won't be able to hold people together. And I think we see this when he talks about Christianity and Judaism today. And you'll see that, and I'll get into that again more next week than today. Um, but it's not the distinction doesn't hold, right? So when we talk about the values that we believe in, when we talk about attributes of God, those are not objective facts, but it doesn't mean that they're not true. And I think his understanding of what true data is limited, and I think um, um, that's a limitation in his analysis there. He's very prejudiced against religious constructs, and part of it is his context in Israel, where religion is politicized in Israel, right? So where Jewish faith is part of the technology of the story that's told by the right, and that came in that last page when he says that Israel is chosen by God to have sovereignty over over the land, and that's God's, and that's divine, that's the divine given inheritance as title to the land, and the negative results for that is the occupation of the Palestinian people. So he sees that as a very negative consequence of believing in a theological idea. There are other ways of understanding what God calls us to do, which he doesn't seem to understand as much. We'll go into that in it. And then you look here, he talks about American constitutionalism, and he says, rejecting Plato's recommendations, the authors of the US Constitution, the founders, did not deceive anyone about the text's origins. Top of 35. They did not pretend that the text came down from heaven, unlike religious fundamentalists, or that it had been inspired by some god. Rather, they acknowledged that it was an extremely creative legal fiction generated by fallible human beings. And his point is, by recognizing that it's a legal fiction created by fallible human beings, that that's their honesty there. And my reaction there, which I wrote in my margin, I said he doesn't understand the way that the fundamentalist right wing in this country understands the Constitution, because American constitutionalism is a civic religion. It's a kind of religion, and in my interpretation, at least, originalism, right, which is the idea that the text of the Constitution is perfect, and that it is, and we need to accept it, right, and can't reinterpret it. So the way that that's argued in constitutional discourse seems to me is not fundamentally different than the way that right-wing theologians will argue that you can't reinterpret a biblical or a theological tenet because it's given by God. When you say this is what the founders gave, then it closes discussion in the same way that religious fundamentalism closes discussion. Again, get more into that next week and after, when he talks about documents and errors. I want to get through documents today. We talk about errors and how it's called a self-regulating mechanism. But I want to share one thing. There was an article that I was just the Conservative Judaism has a magazine called Masorti. Out of focus there. There we go. Masorti, the new journal of conservative Judaism, and the winter issue is all focused on how you teach halakha, Jewish law and conservative movement. And mine was my focus isn't working there. The lead article was for me, and it's called Five Challenges in Teaching Halakha in what's my title? In the Conservative Movement. I talked about this once at a Saturday morning at Temple Israel, and they took one quote from me, which is right on the back of the issue. And it says, I wrote, the theological challenge of teaching halakha demands that we explain how our decisions are at the same time humanly fallible and yet divinely perfect. And my point there is that the divinely perfect is the narrative of that we understand that this is what God calls us to do. But at the same time, we need to also understand that it's humanly fallible, and it's the challenge to explain both at the same time. And Harari doesn't seem to understand that. He sees religion as just teaching that something is divinely perfect. And since we know that that's a fiction, he knows that, therefore we move on beyond that. And we'll see in the next chapter how his understanding of his Israeli Jewish identity is not theological, but very national based. And it's we'll see how that develops. So we'll go back to this. So at the end of that page on 35, he says the U.S. Constitution was fundamentally different from stories that denied their fictive nature and claimed divine origin, such as the Ten Commandments. And I just completely disagree with that sentence 100%. He writes, like the U.S. Constitution, the Ten Commandments endorse slavery. The 10th commandment says, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or his male or female slave. I said before, we're going to get to the 10 commandments. So he says this implies that God is perfectly okay with people holding slaves and objects only to the coveting of slaves belonging to someone else. But unlike the U.S. Constitution, the 10 commandments fail to provide any amendment mechanism. There is no 11th commandment that says you can amend commandments by a 2/3 majority vote. So in this article that I wrote for the Masorti Journal, I actually critique this and other passages in Nexus, and I said he completely misunderstands how religion works. That Of course, there is a way to reinterpret it. When we read the Ten Commandments in synagogue, we don't believe that it means it's okay to have slaves because we understand that as religious communities, our understanding of the story changes. And there are amendment mechanisms and there are ways to reinterpret that. There's a book, one second, I'm just reaching across the screen here, a book that I started reading. I'll talk more about this next week when we talk about how errors are dealt. It's by the Harvard Law and History professor Joe Lepore called "We the People: A History of the U.S. Constitution." And what it is, it's a whole history of the Constitution and the attempts to amend it. And she sort of bemoans that since the 1970s, the amendment that uh, sets the voting age at 18, federal voting age. There's been no serious discussion in the last half century, really, on amending the Constitution, and it's been frozen, and how that's a problem and not the way that the Constitution was originally intended. And she has sections where she talks about, and she talks about the Ten Commandments here too. And I'll just uh, show you that section there when she says that she compares the intent of the Constitution, which is amendable, to something like the Ten Commandments, which is not amendable. Says that constitutions are meant to be revised and meant to be amended, unlike scriptures that are intended to be permanent. And again, it's the same kind of just misunderstanding of how religion works, which is the same error, I think, or that we see in Harari. That Harari, if he's giving us a way of understanding how human societies construct themselves and communities form, then the same the same interpretive framework needs to apply across the board. And we often see from secular intellectuals a dismissal of religious communities and the value of religious formations, and I think that's a weakness, and that the perspectives would be much stronger if they had a better appreciation there of what we do, in a community like Temple Israel. So going back to Harari, on page 36, he writes, all human political systems are based on fictions, but some admit it and some do not. Being truthful about the origins of our social order makes it easier to make changes in it. If humans like us invented it, we cannot amend it, we can amend it, I'm sorry, but such truthfulness comes at a price, and that's true. Then he says at the top of 38, religions always claim to be an objective and eternal truth rather than a fictional story invented by humans. And my reaction to that is that neither is fully accurate, that religions do not claim to be objective, eternal truth. Religious truth is just as complicated as any other type, and that neither do they claim to be fictional stories invented by humans. They claim to be attempts to understand the reality of what it means to be human, like all other narratives try to do. So wrapping up, he concludes the chapter on page 39. Instead of a march of progress, the history of human information networks is a tightrope walk trying to balance truth with order. And then in the 20th century, we aren't much better at finding the right balance than our ancestors were in the Stone Age. So before he said good news, here's the bad news, right? Contrary to what the mission statements of corporations like Google and Facebook imply, simply increasing the speed and efficiency of our information technology does not necessarily make the world a better place. It only makes the need to balance truth and order more urgent. And that's the important call, prophetic call that he's doing in this book. So let me jump into chapter 3, unless there's any comments or questions at this point. And chapter 3 is called Documents, the Bite of the Paper Tigers. So if the first technological leap, this is sort of like, remember in 2001, A Space Odyssey, where they write tools and then the AI at the end, these like quantum leaps of human technology. So it's like this. The first leap is the ability to tell a story that separates sapiens from other apes, and then The second leap is the ability of documents and the written word. And that's the division between prehistory and history, right? So prehistoric times is when we didn't have written records, and then the ability of the written word. And what's so interesting is that he begins and ends the chapter with his own Jewish story, right? He starts with Zion. He starts and closes the chapter by talking about Zionism. The beginning, he's talking about Herzl and Bialik. So Theodor Herzl was the founder of political Zionism, and Chaim Nachman Bialik is considered the father of Hebrew poetry, modern Israeli Hebrew poetry. And both were Europeans. Herzl was Hungarian and Bialik was Ukrainian. And he makes that point, right? Neither lived in Israel. Um, and he talks about Bialik's poem, which in the City of Slaughter, which he says is required reading in Israeli high schools. It's a long, complex, very difficult poem that is all about the suffering that Jews experienced in the wake of a pogrom, and then the call to move beyond that suffering and to redeem, the spirit of the martyrs and stand up for one's human dignity, which he argues inspires the Jewish people through the Zionist narrative to become farmers and soldiers, which were two things that Jews did not do in the Europe that Bialik knew. And of course, Herzl's writings in Old New Land, Alt Neuland, and the Jewish state is imagining what a Jewish sovereignty, a Jewish sovereign state could look like. And he explains sort of very emotionally how Herzl wrote Old New Land in 1902. It's a utopian novel set in 1923, and it ignores the realities on the ground in Palestine. It just talks about starting an old land, new life. It doesn't talk about the realities of the problem with there are Arab residents there. But this idea of an old new land, the appears in Hebrew under the title Tel Aviv, which is a loose Hebrew translation of Old New Land. The city of Tel Aviv, established 7 years after the book's publication, took its name from the book. While Bialik is Israel's national poet, Herzl is known the visionary of the state. It's an amazing example of the ability to tell a story through the written word and how that affects the reality, right? That here, it's not a book that's telling about a place. It's a city that's one of the most important cities in the world today that was founded on the basis of a book, right? Taken from the title of a book. It's extraordinary if you think about it that way in terms of the power of storytelling and writing, which is what Harari is trying to talk about in in the book here. And then I go to page 44. He says, then he makes the list that there's two different kinds of, like throughout this book, this chapter, talking about bureaucracy and mythology. And he says these are the two elements of complex societies. That mythology is a story that you tell that unites people, which was the focus of last chapter. And then bureaucracy uses the written word to organize a complex society. And that and he writes on page 44 at the top of the page, we easily remember stories, but we find it difficult to remember lists. This is an important fact about how the human brain processes information. Evolution has adapted our brains to be good at absorbing, retaining, and processing even very large quantities of information when they are shaped into a story. And here and later in the chapter, he talks about the Ramayana, this Hindu epic, mythological epic that where people can remember all the different relations of the different people and the complex family and all the struggles. So the mini series that was put on in the late 80s had 78 episodes. It was the most watched program in television history, to 650 million viewers. But we're not as interested in lists. But that's why we need lists to be written down. And that's why when societies got complex, the creation of writing began by just keeping lists and numbers and records, and that was necessary there. And at the bottom, in the middle of page 45, unlike national poems and myths, which can be stored in our brains, complex national taxation and administration systems have required a unique, non-organic information technology in order to function. This technology is the written document. So that was the next leap that was necessary in order to hold complex communities together. And for us at Temple Israel, we should all appreciate that the very end of 45 is the most exciting part of the book. It's superscript 13. Did anyone look up footnote 13 to this chapter? If you look up footnote 13 to this chapter, which you find, let me just flip there, in the endnotes, it's on page 420. The very first name in the endnote is, Annette's laughing there, Ira Spar, our own Ira Spar. He quotes, it says, so what that footnote says is Ira Spar, editor, cuneiform text in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Volume 1, Tablets, Cones, and Bricks of the 3rd and 2nd Millennium BC, New York, Metropolitan Museum of Art, 1988, pages 10 to 11. So that is the footnote. So he's quoting from Ira Spar, who was put together the tablets that he's talking about there. When I read that, I ran the book and I showed it to Ira at one Kiddush. I said, "Look, you made it into Harari, which has become a bestseller in multiple languages. You can buy this book in airport bookstores pretty much anywhere in the world. And there's our own Iris Bar on page 420, book 13. Now, most people don't get to the endnotes, but as I said, if you sometimes you find nice things in the footnotes there. Go, Ira. Yeah, indeed. So, okay.
Rabbi,
So
what did he say when you showed it to him?
he smiled.
He gave you an Ira answer.
He gave an Ira answer. He said, maybe I'll have to read Harari after all. I think that's what he said. All right. So page 46. Like stories and all other information technologies in history, written documents did not necessarily represent reality accurately. And this is a great thing. It's the kind of thing that Ira would definitely point out, right? That the Ur tablet that he's talking about from Ira's book, right? That has 15 sheep were delivered on the second day of the month, 7 sheep on the third day, 11 sheep on the fourth, 219 on the fifth, 47 on the sixth, and so on until 3 sheep were delivered on the 28th. In total, the clay tablet says 896 were received that month, about the deliveries to the royal administration to keep track of the resources. And when you study the tablet, it shows that there's actually a math error, and that the document says there's 896 animals received during that month. But when modern scholars, including Ira Spar, added up all the individual entries, they got to a total of 898. But the sum in the document itself, it says, adds up to 896. So the scribe who wrote the document apparently made a mistake when he calculated the overall tally, and the tablet preserved this mistake for posterity. That's amazing, right? It's one of our earliest bureaucratic lists of numbers, and the scribe made a mistake. And it's a great example. It shows that sometimes, as Harari says right here, whether true or false, written documents created new realities, even though sometimes they're false. And that's just like narratives, just like stories. Bureaucratic lists can also, errors can accrue, but the creation of this document still create their own reality, their intersubjective reality, even if there are errors made. And that happens all the time. He writes, documents change the method used for creating intersubjective realities. In oral cultures, intersubjective realities were created by telling a story that many people repeated with their mouths and remembered in their brains. But brain capacity consequently placed a limit on the kinds of intersubjective realities that humans created. Humans couldn't forge an intersubjective reality that their brains couldn't remember. This limit could be transcended, however, by writing documents. The documents didn't represent an objective empirical reality. The reality was the documents themselves. As we shall see later in the chapters, written documents thereby provided precedents and models that would eventually be used by computers. The ability of computers to create intersubjective realities is an extension of the power of clay tablets and pieces of paper, which is great there. So it is 10:32. When I do at the synagogue, I have to end always sharply at 10:30 because I have a Hebrew high school class because of the snow, and you look out the window, it's extraordinary. I'm not rushing to teach my high school class, so I'm gonna keep, we're gonna go over time because I do want to finish this chapter, right, so give me another 15 minutes or so, with your indulgence. So he talks about ownership, and he says that ownership is a key example of how written documents are so important in establishing ownership. And ownership itself is an intersubjective reality, right? Ownership is an idea that someone owns something. And we see how that's being played out in the news today as well, with all the rhetoric going back and forth about Greenland, right? Where there are written documents, there are treaties that go back to just the post-war period, right? The early 50s. It says the U.S. has the right to have bases for national security, but the president responded. It says it's not about the details of the treaty. What's important is ownership. And ownership again is an idea. And the why that idea is so important to the president is a question that historians will probably discuss after our time. But it's telling that it's the first example that Harari focuses on as it's basically a fiction ownership, but it's a fiction that's created through the reality of documents. And when a document records, you have a deed to your property, and that deed, and that why that deed is filed with the state, and we put our copies in our safety deposit box because the document establishes the reality that we are the owner of a certain property. And he talks about the old Assyrian dialect, the bottom of 47, that you kill a document when a debt is repaid. We still do that today, right? When you pay off a mortgage, you burn the mortgage, right? So there's that sense of burning, whether you actually burn the piece of paper or not. We still have this idea that it's the document, that it was the reality of the debt in that case, and then you burn the document when the debt is over, and then you have the full deed, right? I When I moved from New York to New Jersey, and I purchased my first car here as a New Jersey resident, I was surprised that the dealership didn't give me the title document. Because in New York, you buy a car, you get the title, you put in your safety deposit box, you want to sell the car, you sign the back, there's a thing on the back. New Jersey, I say, where's the title? And the dealership says, in New Jersey, you don't get the title until you pay off your car loan. We'll send it to you in 5 years. You know, so and that's about the ownership, right? Because the ownership, in a sense, is shared with the bank. In New York, the document, there's a lien on the document where it says, and then you get the titles reissued when the bank loan is paid off. In New Jersey, you don't get the piece of paper until you're the 100% owner. And well, that's a bureaucratic difference in how it's handled between two states on the opposite sides of the Hudson River. It's telling about how the power of the piece of paper, right, and telling the story of who really owns my car and who has a right to sell it, and etc. So that brings him into his discussion of bureaucracy and his explanation of actually, before I get that, there's this bottom of 49 to page 50. He writes, bureaucracy is the way people in large organizations solved the retrieval problem and thereby created bigger and more powerful information networks. But like mythology, bureaucracy too tends to sacrifice truth for order. So it's basically, how do you store the information? Bureaucracy is how you organize information. And then he talks in the middle of 50, it's a fascinating discussion how the etymology of the word bureaucracy, kratzy is the power, like autocracy, plutocracy, but this is the krasi of the bureau, and a bureau is a desk. So this is the power is in the desk, and literally it's the image is the drawers of the desk, that the different things were put in different drawers, and that's how a bureaucracy is run from desk drawers. And whether it's a drawer or a file or a virtual file in a computer cloud, that's how organization is stored. Um, and then he talks about how government, large governments establish different departments that focuses on different things. And sometimes they're in conflict with each other. So the middle of 51, a bureaucrat is tasked with increasing industrial production. is likely to ignore environmental considerations or fall outside her purview and perhaps dump toxic waste into a nearby river, leading to an ecological disaster downstream. If the government then establishes a new department to combat pollution, its bureaucrats are likely to push for ever more stringent regulations, even if this results in the economic ruin for communities upstream. Ideally, someone should be able to take into account all the different considerations and aspects, but such a holistic approach requires transcending or abolishing the bureaucratic division. So that's his criticism of bureaucracy, and it was and sometimes you have this conflict of different departments that each is only in its own domain, and he's saying you don't have a holistic view. And I think that it sometimes happens that way, but what I think he's misunderstanding is that the way that a bureaucratic government, in my mind, is supposed to work is that you have a responsible, it's the same way that any large corporation is supposed to work, that you have a responsible executive. And the responsibility of the executive and the board is to look at the whole picture. So, for example, think about how Temple Israel runs, right? We have different committees, and the different committees are looking at very specific functions. So early childhood is interested in early childhood, and the school board is interested in the Hebrew school, and adult education is interested in that, and the house committee is interested in the building and that the building is working properly, and the finance committee is focused on making sure that we have enough funds, and all of these different committees, and we have more. We have a lot of committees. All have their own specific functions, right? So a membership committee, and sometimes they come into conflict. So a membership committee wants to expand our in-reach and outreach for our members and prospective members to feel connected with Temple Israel. One of the ways to do that is to make, nice barbecues and parties and invite a lot of people to join in. That costs money. So the membership committee wants to spend money in order to fulfill its goal, whereas the finance committee is going to say, wait, hold on. I want you to spend less money because the less money you spend, the more money we have to cover our expenses. An example in every bureaucracy where you'll have conflicts between different committees or in a government between different departments or ministries. But what I don't understand why he doesn't stress is that if you have a responsible head of government, then the head of government's role is exactly to have that holistic perspective. And that's the key, that a bureaucracy is not just different drawers, but the different drawers are a part of one desk. And he misses that in his analogy and in his interpretation. So, as I said, with a company, you have a CEO and you have a board. With a synagogue, you have different committees, but the board of trustees of the synagogue, as well as the president and the at least the rabbi as the head of staff, that our job is to look at it holistically and to balance it and to make sure that all of these different spokes are working to move one wheel. Right. So we're looking at all the different functions, whereas an individual committee is looking at one function, and you need both in order for any organization to function properly. And I don't understand why he doesn't focus on that. And in most of history, the head of a state is the crown, is the sovereign. And it's interesting that the crown is the term that's used because the crown is the head, which is the brain of the organism. So a brain, what the brain does is it gets lots of signals from different parts of the body, and the brain kind of organ puts it in order and regulates the different systems in the same way that the crown of the state is supposed to regulate the different interests. And it's also why in many systems, the crown is above politics, right? Where in a parliamentary system, the different political parties are responsible to their constituencies, but the crown is responsible to the entire populace. And when large democracies start to fail, from my an analytical perspective, the problems that they face is when they start to lose that ability to focus on the needs of the entire state and focus more on one particular constituency. And that's what we call partisanship and the problems of polarization that we're seeing in this country, right? Where and it's also, one could argue, part of the basic problem of the American system, where the president is the head of state, but is also the head of his or her party, right? So when a president is as is our current system, um, um, responsible to his or her constituency, then how can the president at the same time protect the rights of all of the citizens, right? There's an inherent conflict there, and in a parliamentary system, you have a distinction between parliament and the head of state who's above politics, and in the American system, the president is not above politics. Not that having a head of state, there are problems with the other system also, right? Every system has problems, but I raise that in just to say that theoretically, a healthy state, like any organization, needs a head that can focus on the holistic whole, which is different from the individual desk drawers that are focusing on particular needs. He then goes on to say that it's a problem of education, where it's the bottom of 51 when he says that when people studying, they're just focusing on their field and they're lacking a holistic perspective. And that is a problem. And he talks about higher academics, the next page, that you have that everything you're publishing is such a specific, the problem of specialization in academia, and that we don't have people looking at the broader picture. Harari himself is offering his own writing as a solution to that problem, where he's doing this broad world history because most scholars are only focusing on very specific fields. What I think is missing in his description of the educational system, which is understandable, is because he's not American, he's Israeli. And the Israeli university system follows the European system, where when you enter university studies, you're just specializing in one field and you only study that one field. And one of the real beauties of the American system is the of higher education is the commitment to liberal education on the bachelor's level, which is that, yes, you have a major, but the ideal of liberal education is that we send our kids to college and they learn everything. Some like me are going to be more interested in history and literature courses. Other people are going to be more interested in science and math courses. But everyone has to learn a little bit of something to get that sense of a holistic sense of engaging with knowledge and wisdom. And that's something that's unique and very special to American higher education, although American higher education is facing a lot of challenges today, as we all well know. But this was something that was always an advantage of the American system over the European, and Israeli system is European in its specialization. So, okay, then let me move along. I don't want to keep you all too long. So moving to 54, the end of that section, he talks about bureaucracy. And the problem is what the dangers of a bureaucracy is it puts a label on you. And the label might be pure convention, but it can still determine your fate. And he's going to go into that when he talks about his own grandfather's story with being labeled as a Jew. It's something that we certainly understand in the history of American bureaucracy and the victims of the American system, where people have been identified by definitions of race, by definitions of national origin, the profiling, and we see the dangers of that as being carried out now in Minnesota and in other places. It's a labeling based on the bureaucratic need to put people in. Again, think about the image of different drawers in the desk, and while it may seem it's just a matter of classification, it can affect people's fates. And those definitions, all those definitions are conventions, right? They're not objective. Then go into 55, and this is one of the other best lines in the book. The best line in the book here, I think. I wrote best line in my margin. When you flush the toilet, where does the waste go? It goes into the deep state. It's fantastic, right? And the deep state, because we hear and we've heard a lot of rhetoric, political rhetoric about the problems, the dangers of the deep state. The president speaks about that a lot. Here he says that's where your waste goes, it goes to the deep state. But then it's a very serious argument that he goes on. He talks about the way that London was able to survive the cholera epidemic and then in contemporary India as well with the proper use of waste and disposal of waste, and that to keep wastewater and drinking water separate. And that's ultimately a bureaucratic function in a complex city, right? But that's something that's not exciting about sewage engineering, but it is something that is essential. And that's where the deep state, it's deep because it's underground, subterranean, but it's where bureaucracy is essential for human health. And that's the argument he makes throughout this book, that bureaucracy is not a bad thing. It can be used for very, very good things, but it could also be used for very, very bad things. Um, I was thinking, I was reading about this that when I grew up, our waste didn't go in the deep state. I grew up in northern Westchester where the waste went into the backyard because we had septic fields. So I was thinking, I wonder if septic fields are a kind of postmodern solution for the, overbuilt modern industrial bureaucratic society that we live in. Now, obviously, the option of having a septic field is a very first world problem and only an option if you have a backyard. But it makes us think in terms of the construction of both literal and figurative of urban structures. At the bottom of 56, sewage isn't the stuff of epic poems, but it is a test of a well-functioning state, which is fantastic. Okay, so biological dramas. This is what I mentioned before. Mythology and bureaucracy are the twin pillars of every large-scale society. The stories you tell and then the ways that you organize this society. Moving along here. Page 58, the middle of the page. For better or worse, literate bureaucracies tended to strengthen the central authority at the expense of ordinary citizens. So because the bureaucratic systems are so complicated and so hard to understand, they require central processing. And it's a very interesting theory. He says that that's what shifts the power from a local authority to a central authority. And it's the name, it's the means to maintain that society requires the central authority to gain power at the expense of the local authority, and that's an overall truism, I think, across human history. There, he goes through, and then he has a very fascinating. We're not going to go through this here. His discussion of the Ramayana, that Hindu epic, and the various different themes about how people relate to each other through narrative. And then he moves from there to a discussion of it's a very literate chapter. We started by talking about Bialik's poem and Herzl's political writings, talks about the Ramayana, and then he ends with Kafka. And he talks about Kafka's The Trial. This is on page 62. He's got Shakespeare in the next chapter also. So it's a great chapter. And in Kafka, The Trial, it's a short story about the danger of bureaucracy. How a bank clerk named K, which makes us think of Kafka, right? He's arrested by unidentified officials of an unfathomable agency for an unnamed crime. Sort of the quintessential nightmare of living in a bureaucratic society. And he says that in the next paragraph, in bureaucratic societies, the lives of ordinary people are often upended by unidentified officials of an unfathomable agency for incomprehensible reasons. I'm sorry. Now, there's been a lot of discussion with the ICE activities that why they wear the ski masks, and part of it is to protect the personal identities of the agents who are engaged in unpopular functions. But it's also makes me think of this here, that unidentified officials, right? That you don't, when you have this bureaucratic control over a population, that it's not personal because it's leaped. So and his point is, this is where the storytelling becomes dangerous, right? Because it's established a society that is so large and where the central authority is so powerful, which we're seeing this in Minnesota, right, where the local authorities don't have any power vis-a-vis the federal power, and no check on the federal power, except they're trying through the courts, right, to have access to the evidence of the shootings. But that's what Kafka's talking about and Harari's talking about here. That then the power of the central bureaucracy is completely impersonal, and Kafka brings that to the extreme, right, where unidentified agents of an unidentified agency is persecuting him for an unidentified crime. So at the bottom of that paragraph, evolution has primed our minds to understand death by a tiger. Our minds find it much more difficult to understand death by a document, which is a great line. And then, and that's what he goes to when he tells his own story at the end of the chapter, which begins on page 65. And he goes into detail telling the story of his maternal grandfather who was upended by a government census and by the inability to find a crucial document. So what basically happened was that there was living in what was now Ukraine, was then in the Habsburg Empire. And there was a Jewish census, and it was just paperwork, and they didn't think it was that important. And that was in 1913. And then in 1936, there were 758,000 Jews living in Romania. They were 4.2% of the population. And then there were about another 11,000 Jews who entered from the USSR that were refugees from the communist revolution. But then you have a fascist government that comes into power in 1937. And the fascist government manufactures a reality. All right. So, and this is, of course, very prescient for us. We can relate it certainly to stories in our own country now, where that there is this great threat of thousands and thousands of Jewish refugees who are illegally entering the country and flooding into Romania. Now, this is in 1937. This is before World War II. The Nazis are in power in Germany, and this is a fascist government that's come into power in Romania. And it manufactures a set that is completely not based at all on the reality, because Jews were only 4.2% and there were only 11,000 refugees. But the government claimed that that 500,000 Jews had entered Romania illegally, and the total number of Jews in the country was 1.5 million. Right, so it's completely off the mark of the reality. And then, but by telling that narrative, by the fascist government telling that narrative, the next step was to activate the power of the bureaucratic central state to fight a manufactured reality. Go find the illegal Jews, arrest them, and deport them, which they then do. And at the top of 66, he says Goga's government stepped in to offer a solution to the imaginary problem invented by its own propaganda. So on January 22nd, 1938, the government issued a law ordering all Jews in Romania to provide documented proof that they were born in Romanian territory and were entitled to Romanian citizenship. So then the problem that his grandfather had was that they couldn't find the proof, the document that he, was living in what was then, a part of Romania. And the news continued to, follow his grandfather. It says out of 758,000 Romanian Jews, 367,000 were stripped of their citizenship because they didn't have the documents that the government required to prove that they were Romanian. And Harari's grandfather, Bruno, was among those 367,000 Jews who were stripped of their citizenship. Um, Even though he was born in Chernivtsi and had lived there all his life, the thought that he needed to prove to some bureaucrat that he was not an alien struck him as ridiculous. And in 1938, his mother fell ill and died, and Bruno felt he had much bigger things to worry about than chasing documents. But then in December 1938, the official letter arrived from Bucharest canceling his citizenship. And as an alien, he was promptly fired from his job at a radio shop. He was now not only alone and jobless, but stateless without much prospect for employment. And then 9 months later, World War II erupted, and the dangers for paperless Jews were mounting. The vast majority of Jews in his situation in Romania were murdered in the Holocaust. And he managed to, smuggled himself onto trains and ships, caught and arrested. In 1940, he finally managed to board one of the last ships bound for Palestine before the gates of hell slammed shut. And when he arrived in Palestine, he was immediately imprisoned by the British as an illegal immigrant. But after 2 months in prison, the British offered him a deal by serving in the British Army in North Africa and Italy. He then got papers and then was eventually, and that's how Harari's family ended up living in Israel. It's not only is it a story that's like a real life story of Kafka's The Trial, right, where this bureaucracy is just he's lived in Romania all his life, and suddenly he's not a Romanian because he doesn't have a piece of paper. It also is the bookend of how he opens the chapter with Bialik and Herzl, because he goes back to Zionism. And whereas at the beginning of the document, there's a sort of under the level criticism of Zionism, right? Because they're creating a narrative that's not related to the situation on the ground with Jews and Arabs. At the end of the chapter, he says how Zionism, that narrative, was what allowed him to exist, right? Because that was the only place where his grandfather was able to escape to. He was able to escape to make Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael, and then eventually settle and become Israeli. So there's a fascinating sort of a balance there. And that's how the narrative can sometimes be the antidote to the threat of bureaucracy, because that was a narrative that ended up being the narrative of Harari's family as an Israeli family and how they came to be Israelis. So the chapter concludes on page 68 and 69. Now he's looking forward there. A lot of times, the end of his chapter, he gives us a teaser for what else is happening in the book. He says powerful information networks can do both good and ill, depending on how they are designed and used. And this is again his critique that he beats through the whole book: that don't be naive to think just more information is good. Merely increasing the quantity of information in a network does not guarantee its benevolence or make it any easier to find the right balance between truth and order. That is a key historical lesson for the designers and users of the new information networks of the 21st century. And then later in the page, AI is taking up the role of both bureaucrats and myth makers, right? So he's talking in this chapter how mythology, the storytellers, and bureaucrats, the record keepers, the two types of information technology, AI is taking over both. And AI systems know how to find and process data better than flesh and blood bureaucrats, and AI is acquiring the ability to compose stories better than most humans. So that's the sort of the problems of the future that in the second half of the book he talks more about. So I went a half an hour over. Okay, we're going to meet next week in person, and I'll be more disciplined with the time because again, I'm going to have to leave at 10:30 for my high school class. But the focus of next week is going to be on chapter 4. So if you want to review or read something for next week, chapter 4 is about errors. And if I have time to get in the next chapter of decisions a bit, I will. But it's errors is where I'm going to have a lot to say on what he calls self-correcting mechanism. Any comments or questions before we break? I'm looking at a bunch of this. I see that, and that says a lot of thing about septic systems. And okay, great. Any hands? Okay, so I'm going to turn off the recording now, and thank you all for joining. And stay safe in the snow. As the villa required, please do not. You should stay off the roads at least till tomorrow when the snow stops and they have a chance to clear the road. So everyone stay safe and Shavua Tov.